The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 8, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was just another busy Monday morning, with travelers rushing to their gates, wheeling suitcases behind them and clutching their phones and coffee cups. Among the crowd walked a woman who didn't quite match the usual stereotype of a billionaire tech CEO. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue blazer over a white silk blouse, paired with tailored pants. Her carry-on bag was from a high-end designer, but it wasn't flashy, just practical and well-made, much like its owner. This was Ms. Chen, the founder and CEO of one of Silicon Valley's most innovative tech companies. Having built her company from the ground up over the past 15 years, Ms. Chen had become known in the business world for her brilliant mind and humble approach. She'd started coding in her garage, and now her company, Clearview Technologies, was revolutionizing artificial intelligence applications in healthcare. But you wouldn't know any of this just by looking at her. As she walked through the terminal, she noticed how other business travelers were being treated. The flight attendants stationed near the gates greeted them with warm smiles and friendly gestures. She observed a white businessman in a similar blazer receiving particularly attentive service, with staff rushing to help him with his luggage and guide him to the premium check-in counter. Ms. Chen approached Gate A7, where her first-class flight to San Francisco was preparing to board. She'd taken this route countless times before, so many that she'd lost count. The morning flights were her preference. They allowed her to reach the West Coast in time for afternoon meetings. This time, she was heading back for a crucial board meeting where her company would be announcing a revolutionary new medical diagnostic tool. The gate area was bustling with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists. Premium passengers were beginning to line up as the gate agents prepared to start the boarding process. Ms. Chen stood quietly in the priority lane, reviewing some emails on her phone. She was wearing her usual supple accessories, a simple pearl necklace and her late mother's watch, a treasured reminder of the woman who'd taught her to stay strong in the face of adversity. A flight attendant with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a crisp uniform was checking on the gate preparations. She moved through the first-class line, offering assistance to various passengers, her smile bright and professional. "Good morning, sir. May I help you with your bag?" she asked a man in front of Ms. Chen. "Is this your first time flying first class with us? Let me tell you about our premium services." When the attendant reached Ms. Chen, something shifted. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by a look of barely concealed skepticism. The flight attendant's eyes darted from Ms. Chen's face to her carry-on bag, then to her boarding pass, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together in her mind. "Excuse me," the attendant said, her tone notably different from how she'd addressed the other passengers. "This line is for first-class boarding only." She emphasized each word, as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well, despite Ms. Chen having made no indication that she wasn't a native speaker. Ms. Chen had encountered such situations before. Over her years of success, she'd learned that some people had a very specific image of what a billionaire tech CEO should look like, and she didn't fit that image. She'd developed a calm, measured approach to these moments, knowing that her response would speak volumes about her character. She reached into her designer bag and retrieved her boarding pass, holding it up with a steady hand. "Yes, I'm aware," she replied softly but firmly. "I'm in seat 2A. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the boarding pass. Instead of acknowledging her mistake or apologizing, she glanced around and made a supple gesture to one of her colleagues. "Just one moment, please," she said, before walking briskly toward the front of the gate area. Other passengers in line had begun to notice the interaction. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with undisguised interest. A few were typing on their phones, perhaps sharing yet another story of prejudice playing out in public. Ms. Chen remained poised, though she felt her heart rate quicken slightly. She built her company on the principle of using technology to break down barriers and improve lives. Every product they developed was tested rigorously to eliminate biases. Yet here she was, facing one of the most basic forms of prejudice in one of the most common settings. Through the glass walls of the gate area, she could see the massive aircraft that would carry them across the country. The morning sun glinted off its polished surface, and ground crew members scurried around it like busy ants. In a few hours, she would be standing in front of her board of directors, presenting innovations that could change the face of medical diagnosis. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone capable of such achievements could be questioned about her right to sit in a first-class cabin. She noticed the flight attendant returning, this time accompanied by the pilot. He was tall and carried himself with the authority of someone used to being in command. His captain's stripes gleamed on his shoulders as he approached, his expression a mixture of authority and suspicion. More passengers had gathered behind her now, the priority line growing longer as the scheduled boarding time approached. The air was thick with tension, and Ms. Chen could feel all eyes on her. This moment, she realized, would define more than just her morning. It would become another chapter in the ongoing story of prejudice and power in American corporate culture. Little did the flight crew know that their actions in the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would reshape their airline's entire approach to customer service and employee training. As the pilot drew closer, Ms. Chen reached for her phone, knowing that documentation was often the first step toward meaningful change. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the scene as if it were on stage. In many ways, it was a stage where old prejudices were about to collide with new realities, where assumptions would be challenged, and where one woman's composed response to discrimination would catalyze institutional change. The story was about to unfold in ways none of them could predict, starting right here in the priority boarding line of Gate A7, where a tech CEO who didn't fit someone else's preconception of success stood her ground with quiet dignity, ready to turn an act of discrimination into an opportunity for progress. The pilot stopped a few feet away from Ms. Chen, adjusting his cap with one hand while keeping the other firmly behind his back. His presence had created a small bubble of silence in the busy gate area, with nearby passengers pretending to look at their phones while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing his question to the flight attendant rather than Ms. Chen. His voice carried that particular tone of authority that people in uniform often use when they've already made up their minds about a situation. The flight attendant straightened her posture, speaking just loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket, Captain." She emphasized the word claims in a way that made it clear she had her doubts. Ms. Chen watched as other first-class passengers continued boarding, some awkwardly squeezing past the impromptu interrogation taking place in the priority lane. She noticed a younger flight attendant standing nearby, looking uncomfortable with the situation but remaining silent. "I don't just claim to have a first-class ticket," Ms. Chen spoke up calmly, her voice clear and steady. "I have one. Would you like to scan it?" She held out her boarding pass again, but neither the pilot nor the flight attendant made a move to take it. Instead, the pilot launched into what seemed like a rehearsed speech. "Ma'am, you understand that first-class tickets are premium purchases," he began, speaking slowly and loudly as if addressing someone who might have trouble understanding English. "They cost significantly more than regular tickets if you've somehow ended up with an incorrect boarding pass." Ms. Chen felt her phone buzzing in her pocket, probably her executive assistant confirming the afternoon's board meeting arrangements. The same board meeting where they would be discussing a multi-million-dollar partnership with this very airline to implement their new customer service AI system. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. "I'm quite familiar with the cost of first-class tickets," she replied, maintaining her composure. "I purchase them weekly for myself and my executive team." She reached into her bag, causing both the pilot and flight attendant to tense slightly, a reaction that didn't go unnoticed by the growing audience of waiting passengers. From her bag, she pulled out her laptop, which needed to be stored in the overhead compartment. The movement caused her blazer to shift, revealing the subtle logo of her company embroidered on her silk blouse, a detail that the younger flight attendant suddenly noticed, her eyes widening in recognition. "Captain," the younger flight attendant tried to interject, but the pilot held up his hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, let me explain how our boarding process works," he continued, his condescending tone growing stronger. "First-class passengers typically have priority boarding, are entitled to use the premium lane, and may store 2 carry-on items in the overhead compartments." Ms. Chen completed his sentence. I'm aware of the policies. I've flown over 100,000 miles with your airline this year alone. A businessman waiting in line behind her cleared his throat. Excuse me, Captain, but isn't that Ms. Chen from Clearview Technologies? The pilot's expression flickered for just a moment, but he pressed on. Sir, please, I'm handling this situation. He turned back to Ms. Chen. Now, if you'd step aside so we can sort this out without holding up other passengers. Ms. Chen had already pulled out her phone and opened her airline app, displaying not just her current boarding pass, but her platinum status and accumulated miles. Next to it, she held up her corporate ID, its holographic security features catching the morning light. I'm the CEO of Clearview Technologies, she stated simply. We're your airline's third largest corporate client. In fact, I'm flying to San Francisco today to finalize a deal that would make us your largest technology provider. She paused, letting the information sink in. But perhaps we should discuss that after you've explained to me, and all these passengers, exactly what about my appearance made you question my right to be in this line. The silence that followed was deafening. The younger flight attendant had gone pale, while the older one's face had flushed a deep red. The pilot's authoritative stance had crumbled, replaced by the rigid posture of someone who suddenly realized they'd made a terrible mistake. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. Several had their phones out, though whether they were recording the incident or Googling Clearview Technologies wasn't clear. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was rapidly typing on his phone, likely sharing the story on social media. The younger flight attendant finally found her voice. Ms. Chen, I am so sorry. I recognize your company's logo. We just had a training session about your AI systems last week. They're supposed to help prevent exactly this kind of. She trailed off, realizing she might be making things worse. Ms. Chen nodded acknowledgement to the young woman, appreciating her attempt to make things right. She then turned to the pilot, who was now struggling to maintain his professional demeanor while clearly wishing he could disappear into the cockpit. I believe we've held up the boarding process long enough, Ms. Chen said, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of finality. Unless there are any other aspects of first-class travel you feel I need to be educated about. The pilot straightened his uniform, his face a mask of discomfort. No, ma'am. I apologize for the misunderstanding. The words seemed to cost him considerable effort. The older flight attendant had backed away slightly, suddenly very interested in checking something on her tablet. The younger one stepped forward, gesturing toward the jet bridge. Please, Ms. Chen, allow me to escort you to your seat. As Ms. Chen finally moved toward the aircraft, the other passengers in line began to stir, some shaking their heads in disgust at what they'd witnessed, others whispering among themselves. The businessman who had recognized her gave her a respectful nod as she passed. She paused at the entrance to the jet bridge, turning back to face the pilot and flight attendant. I trust you'll both be professional enough to ensure a safe and comfortable flight for all passengers today, she said, making it clear that despite their treatment of her, she wouldn't demand their immediate removal from duty. We can address this incident through the proper channels after we land. The pilot nodded stiffly, already dreading the report he would have to file. The older flight attendant had found her voice again, though it was notably softer now. Of course, Ms. Chen. We apologize for any inconvenience. As Ms. Chen walked down the jet bridge, she could hear the resumed boarding announcements behind her, now delivered in a notably more subdued tone. She thought about the presentation waiting on her laptop, the one about how AI could help identify and prevent biased treatment in customer service. Sometimes, she reflected, the best arguments for innovation came from unexpected personal experiences. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows of the jet bridge, and Ms. Chen squared her shoulders, ready to turn this uncomfortable incident into something positive. After all, that's what true leadership was about, not just recognizing problems, but creating solutions that would prevent others from facing the same discrimination in the future. As Ms. Chen settled into her first-class seat, 2A, she could feel the weight of stares from other passengers boarding the plane. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others quickly looked away when she caught their eye. The businessman who had recognized her earlier was seated across the aisle, and he leaned over slightly. That was handled with incredible grace, he whispered, genuine admiration in his voice. I've been following your company's work on bias elimination in AI. Never thought I'd see such a clear example of why it's needed. Ms. Chen thanked him with a slight nod, then turned her attention to her phone. She wasn't interested in becoming the center of attention or turning this into a public spectacle. Instead, she opened her contact list and scrolled to a familiar name, the airline's chief of customer relations, Mr. Rodriguez. The older flight attendant who had questioned her earlier was now moving through the cabin, helping other passengers store their bags, pointedly avoiding Ms. Chen's row. The younger attendant, however, approached with a glass of water. "Miss Chen," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am. I should have spoken up sooner." "Thank you," Ms. Chen replied softly. "Sometimes being a bystander is just as uncomfortable as being the target. What's your name?" "Lai," the young attendant replied, surprised by the question. "I just completed training last month." Ms. Chen made a mental note of the name. In her experience, positive change often started with people who recognized their own power to make a difference, no matter their position. She pulled up her recent photos and found the video she had discreetly recorded of the gate incident. It wasn't her style to share such things on social media or use them for public shaming. Instead, she attached it to an email draft, along with her flight details and a brief, professional summary of events. The plane's cabin continued filling with passengers, many of whom were now typing on their phones. No doubt the story was already spreading across social media platforms. Ms. Chen could imagine the headlines. "Tech CEO faces discrimination on major airline," or "Billionaire profiled at airport gate." But that wasn't the kind of change she wanted to create. She pressed the call button, and Lai returned promptly. "Could you please ask the pilot to delay our departure for just 5 minutes? I need to make an important call regarding this incident, and I'd prefer to handle it before we take off." Lai nodded and hurried to the cockpit. Meanwhile, Ms. Chen dialed Mr. Rodriguez's direct number. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Chen, this is unexpected. How can I help you today?" His warm professional tone was exactly what she needed. "Hello, Carlos. I'm currently on Flight 714 to San Francisco, and we've had an unfortunate incident during boarding that I believe requires immediate attention." She described the situation calmly, without emotional embellishment. As she spoke, she could see the pilot shifting uncomfortably in the cockpit doorway, obviously aware that his actions were being reported to his superiors. "I'm sending you a video of the interaction," she continued. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not calling to demand anyone's termination. I'm calling because this is exactly the kind of situation our companies are partnering to prevent." Mr. Rodriguez's voice was grave when he responded. "I'm watching the video now. This is completely unacceptable. I'll have a new flight crew there within 15 minutes. Actually," Ms. Chen interjected, "I have a different suggestion. Rather than immediately removing the crew, let's use this as a learning opportunity. But I do think we need to have a larger conversation about systemic changes." The older flight attendant was now standing nearby, pretending to check the overhead compartments while clearly trying to overhear the conversation. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached up to adjust a bag. "What are you proposing?" Mr. Rodriguez asked, his interest evident in his tone. "Your crew is about to spend 5 hours on a flight with a passenger they profiled and humiliated. That's going to be uncomfortable for everyone, but it's also an opportunity for growth." Ms. Chen paused, watching as the pilot paced nervously near the cockpit. "What if we use this incident as a case study for your new training program?" There was a moment of silence on the line as Mr. Rodriguez considered her words. "You're suggesting we turn this into a teaching moment rather than a disciplinary action." "Exactly. Your crew made assumptions based on appearance. They acted on those assumptions in a way that was unprofessional and discriminatory. But rather than punish them, let's help them understand why it happened and how to prevent it." The businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending not to listen and was now openly nodding in approval. A few other passengers who could hear Ms. Chen's side of the conversation were showing similar signs of respect for her approach. "Ms. Chen," Mr. Rodriguez said finally, "this is why we chose Clearview Technologies as our partner. You see solutions where others might only see problems. I'll make some calls right now. Would you be willing to be part of developing this training program? Of course, she replied. That's actually why I'm heading to San Francisco, to finalize our partnership. This incident just proves how crucial that partnership is. As she ended the call, she noticed both flight attendants and the pilot huddled near the galley, their faces a mixture of relief and shame. The older flight attendant appeared to be wiping tears from her eyes. Lee approached again, this time with a fresh glass of water. The pilot received a call from operations, she said quietly. He asked me to tell you that we're cleared for departure, and she hesitated, glancing back at her colleagues, and that he's grateful for your compassion. Ms. Chen accepted the water with a small smile. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, she said, just loudly enough for her voice to carry to the galley where the crew stood. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane prepared for departure. As they taxied toward the runway, Ms. Chen opened her laptop to review her board presentation. The slides about bias in AI and the importance of human understanding in technology seemed even more relevant now. The morning sun was fully up now, creating a golden glow through the airplane windows. As they accelerated down the runway, Ms. Chen thought about how every challenge was an opportunity for positive change. Today's incident would become more than just another story of discrimination. It would become a catalyst for real transformation in how people treat each other, one training session at a time. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Mr. Rodriguez's response plan kicked into action. His first call went directly to the cockpit, patched through by air traffic control as a priority message. The pilot's voice was noticeably subdued as he answered. In the first-class cabin, the tension was still thick enough to cut with a knife. The older flight attendant moved through her duties like a robot, her face frozen in a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed her distress. Lai, the younger attendant, seemed to be the only crew member capable of making eye contact with Ms. Chen. "Would you like to see the lunch menu?" Lai asked, approaching with a leather-bound folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out. Ms. Chen looked up from her laptop and smiled warmly. "Thank you, Lai. Actually, I'd love to hear your recommendations." She closed her computer, giving the young woman her full attention. It was a small gesture, but one that made Li's shoulders relax visibly. "The chef's special today is excellent," Li said, gaining confidence. "It's a grilled salmon with quinoa." As they discussed the menu options, other passengers watched the interaction with interest. The simple act of treating Lai with kindness, especially after what had happened, spoke volumes about Ms. Chen's character. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilot was receiving detailed instructions from airline management. His responses were clipped and professional, but the strain in his voice was evident even through the cockpit door. The businessman across the aisle leaned over again. "I just got an email from the airline's customer service department," he said quietly. "They're already implementing changes to their training protocols. That was incredibly fast." Ms. Chen nodded, unsurprised. She knew Mr. Rodriguez well enough to expect nothing less. Their companies had been in partnership talks for months, discussing how to use Clearview's AI technology to improve customer service and eliminate bias in daily operations. Her phone buzzed with a message from her executive assistant. Board meeting pushed to 4 p.m. Airline executives requesting urgent meeting upon landing. How would you like to proceed? Before she could respond, another message came through, this time from Mr. Rodriguez. Training team mobilized. New protocols being drafted. Would you be willing to review them before implementation? The older flight attendant passed by, overhearing snippets of the messages being read. Her face paled further, and she quickly disappeared into the galley. The sound of muffled crying could be heard moments later. Lai glanced nervously at the galley curtain, then back at Ms. Chen. "She's not usually like this," she whispered. "She's actually the one who trained me. She's always talked about treating everyone with respect." "Sometimes our unconscious biases surprise even us," Ms. Chen replied gently. "The important thing is what we do after we recognize them." The pilot's voice came over the intercom, sounding strained but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 35,000 feet. The weather in San Francisco is clear, and our expected arrival time is 11:45 a.m. local time. I also want to take a moment to apologize for the incident that occurred during boarding. It was unprofessional and does not reflect the values of our airline." A murmur went through the cabin. Such public admissions of fault were rare in the airline industry. Some passengers nodded approvingly, while others continued recording the announcement on their phones. Ms. Chen opened her laptop again, but instead of returning to her board presentation, she started a new document. She began typing out suggestions for the airline's training program, drawing from her company's experience in developing bias detection algorithms. The older flight attendant finally emerged from the galley, her eyes red but her composure somewhat restored. She approached Ms. Chen's seat with visible effort. "Ms. Chen," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I realize now that I've spent 20 years believing I treated everyone equally. Today showed me how wrong I was. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm ready to learn and change." Ms. Chen looked at the woman's name tag, then met her eyes. "None of us are perfect," she replied. "The real test isn't whether we have biases, it's what we do when they're revealed to us. Would you be willing to help develop the new training program? Your experience could help others learn from this moment." The flight attendant's eyes widened in surprise. "You want my input? After how I treated you?" "Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons," Ms. Chen said. "Your perspective could be invaluable." More messages were flowing in on Ms. Chen's phone. The airline's PR team was asking for guidance on how to address the situation. Social media was already buzzing with passenger accounts of the incident. But instead of the expected outrage, many were sharing their amazement at how the situation was being handled. Lai returned with Ms. Chen's lunch, setting it up carefully. "The chief flight attendant just received word that we're all to report for special training tomorrow," she said quietly. "They're calling it Project Clear Vision. Is that?" Ms. Chen nodded. "Your airline and my company are working together to create better customer service experiences. This incident just helped us identify exactly where we need to focus our efforts." The rest of the cabin crew had noticed the change in atmosphere in first class. The tension was gradually being replaced by something else, not quite comfort, but perhaps understanding. The pilot had stopped pacing in the cockpit, though he still hadn't emerged. As the plane continued its journey westward, Ms. Chen's phone kept buzzing with messages from airline executives, her own team, and Mr. Rodriguez. But she took her time responding, focusing instead on documenting her thoughts for the training program. Sometimes, she knew, the best responses weren't the fastest, but the most thoughtful. The California coast was still hours away, but already this flight had sparked changes that would affect thousands of future travelers. In the galley, the older flight attendant was quietly sharing her realizations with her colleagues. In the cockpit, the pilot was probably reflecting on his own actions. And throughout the cabin, passengers were witnessing how a moment of discrimination could be transformed into an opportunity for growth. The plane was about 2 hours into its journey when something unexpected happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked up to first class from the economy section. She stopped near Ms. Chen's seat, clutching a notebook and looking nervous. "Are you the lady who makes computers kinder?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother hurried up behind her, looking embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. She overheard people talking about what happened at the gate, and she recognized your company's name from her school's computer lab. Ms. Chen smiled warmly at the child. "Yes, that's one way to describe what we do. We try to help computers understand people better so they can treat everyone fairly." The girl's face lit up. "Like in our typing program. It tells me I'm doing great, even though I'm slower than the other kids because of my dyslexia." This interaction caught the attention of other passengers, including the flight crew. Lai, who was nearby preparing drinks, paused to listen. The older flight attendant watched from the galley, her expression thoughtful. "That's exactly right," Ms. Chen said. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, whether by computers or by people. Would you like to tell me more about your experience with our program?" The girl nodded enthusiastically and, with her mother's permission, perched on the empty seat next to Ms. Chen. She opened her notebook, showing drawings of what she imagined computers looking like on the inside, full of hearts and smiling faces alongside the circuits and wires. The businessman across the aisle closed his laptop, listening with interest. Other passengers began sharing their own stories. A teacher who used Clearview's language software to help students with different learning styles, a doctor who relied on their diagnostic tools to treat patients more effectively. The pilot emerged from the cockpit during his break, hesitating when he saw the gathered group. But instead of retreating, he took a deep breath and approached. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I've been thinking about what happened earlier. My behavior was inexcusable. I've spent 20 years in the cockpit, priding myself on treating everyone equally. Today showed me I had blind spots I never recognized." The young girl looked between them, then at her mother. "Did somebody not be kind?" she asked innocently. Ms. Chen exchanged glances with the pilot before responding. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she explained. "But what matters is learning from those mistakes and trying to do better." The girl nodded sagely. "Like when I deleted my brother's game by accident and felt really bad, but then helped him get it back." Several people chuckled, breaking the tension. Even the pilot managed a small smile. "Exactly like that," Ms. Chen agreed. "And now we're going to work together to make sure other people don't make the same mistakes." The mother looked grateful for how Ms. Chen handled the explanation. "We should let you get back to work," she said, standing up. "Thank you for being so kind." As they turned to leave, the girl suddenly turned back. "Can I show you one more drawing? It's my idea for making computers give hugs." While Ms. Chen reviewed the earnest artwork, Lung approached with fresh drinks for everyone gathered around. The older flight attendant, who had been watching from a distance, finally joined the group. "I never realized how many lives your company's work touches," she said quietly. "When I saw you at the gate, I made assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even know I had. Watching you with this little girl, seeing how you've handled everything, it's been eye-opening." The pilot nodded in agreement. "I received word that we're all scheduled for new training sessions starting tomorrow. They mentioned your company's involvement in developing the program." Ms. Chen handed the notebook back to the beaming young artist. "Yes, we'll be working together to create something meaningful from today's experience. Your insights will be valuable. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who have recognized their own need to grow." As the girl and her mother returned to their seats in economy, more passengers began sharing their own stories of times they'd faced prejudice or realized their own biases. The cabin became a space for honest conversation, with the flight crew actively participating instead of just serving drinks. Mr. Rodriguez called again, and this time Ms. Chen put him on speakerphone so the crew could be part of the discussion about the new training program. Their input was immediate and valuable. They knew firsthand the situations where biases could affect customer service. "This is exactly the kind of collaborative approach we need," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "Real change happens when everyone has a voice in the solution." The older flight attendant wiped away tears as she described how her own background had shaped her assumptions. Lai shared her perspective as a new hire who had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to stop it. The pilot spoke about the responsibility of leadership and the importance of acknowledging mistakes. As they began their descent into San Francisco, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable situation had become a powerful lesson in humanity and growth. The young girl waved goodbye as she passed by on her way back to her seat for landing. Her notebook was now full of new drawings, sketches of people from different backgrounds all working together, with computers helping to bridge the gaps between them. "You know," the businessman said as they began their final approach, "I came on this flight planning to read reports all the way to San Francisco. Instead, I got to witness something remarkable, how one person's grace under pressure could turn a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for everyone to learn and grow." The California coast came into view outside the windows, and Ms. Chen thought about how this flight had become so much more than just another business trip. It had become a catalyst for change, sparked by an unfortunate incident, but transformed by the willingness of everyone involved to learn and grow from it. The airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity by the time Ms. Chen's flight landed in San Francisco. News of the incident had reached every level of management, and a response was swift and decisive. The CEO himself had cleared his schedule for an emergency meeting. In a sleek conference room overlooking the bay, Airline executives sat around a massive table, their faces reflecting both concern and determination. Mr. Rodriguez stood at the front of the room, presenting the morning's events with remarkable candor. What happened today wasn't just a PR issue, he said, pointing to video clips from social media. It was a wake-up call. We've talked about bias training for years, but today showed us we need more than just talk. The door opened and Ms. Chen entered the room. The executives all stood, but she waved them back to their seats with a gentle gesture. Please, let's keep this informal. We're here to solve a problem together, not point fingers. The airline's CEO stepped forward, extending his hand. Thank you for coming directly here instead of going to your board meeting. I've spoken with your team, and they understand the importance of this discussion. Ms. Chen set her laptop on the table and opened it. I spent the flight working on some ideas, but first, I'd like to share something that happened during our journey. She told them about the young girl with her notebook full of drawings and how the incident had transformed into a learning experience for everyone on board. The room was silent as she spoke. These weren't just executives hearing about a potential PR crisis, they were people listening to a story that touched on their own hidden biases and assumptions. The crew members who were involved, Ms. Chen continued, they're not bad people. They're not even unusually biased. They simply acted on prejudices they didn't know they had. That's what we need to address. One of the executives, a woman who'd been quietly taking notes, spoke up. We've had diversity training before, but it clearly wasn't enough. What makes your approach different? Ms. Chen pulled up a presentation on the room's main screen. Traditional training tells people what not to do. We're proposing something different, a program that helps people understand why they make the assumptions they make. The presentation showed examples of Clearview's AI technology in action. It could analyze patterns in customer service interactions, identifying potential bias before it affected customers. But more than that, it could help employees understand their own behavior patterns. Imagine a training system that doesn't just tell you that you showed bias, Ms. Chen explained, but helps you understand what triggered it. Was it stress? Time pressure? Unconscious associations? Once you understand the why, you can work on the how of changing it. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward again. We've already scheduled the first training session for tomorrow. The crew from today's flight volunteered to be the first participants. They want to share their experience, to help others learn from it. The airline's head of operations raised his hand. What about immediate changes? We can't wait for everyone to complete the training. You're right, Ms. Chen agreed. That's why we've developed a two-phase approach. She clicked to the next slide, showing a simple but effective plan. Phase 1 would start immediately. A quick response system that would allow any employee to flag potential bias incidents for review. Not for punishment, but for learning. The young flight attendant, Lai, had already helped design the reporting interface, making it simple and non-threatening. Phase 2 was more comprehensive. A complete overhaul of the airline's customer service training, incorporating Clearview's AI technology to help identify patterns and provide real-time guidance. But technology is only part of the solution, Ms. Chen emphasized. The real change happens through human connection and understanding. The crew members from today's flight, they didn't change because of a policy. They changed because they saw the impact of their actions and chose to learn from it. The CEO leaned forward in his chair. What resources do you need to make this happen? It's not about resources, Ms. Chen replied. It's about commitment. Are you ready to create an environment where people feel safe acknowledging their biases? Where mistakes become opportunities for growth rather than reasons for punishment? The room fell silent as the executives considered her words. Then, one by one, they began sharing their own experiences, times they'd made assumptions, times they'd been on the receiving end of prejudice. The woman who'd asked about training earlier spoke up again. I was passed over for promotion 3 times early in my career. Each time, the explanation was different, but the underlying assumption was the same. They couldn't picture someone like me in leadership. Others joined in, and soon the corporate conference room had transformed into a space for honest dialogue. The kind of dialogue that real change requires. Ms. Chen opened her laptop again, this time to show them something she'd been working on during the flight. It was a simple program, but its potential impact was enormous. It would track not just incidents of bias, but also positive interactions, times when employees went above and beyond to ensure everyone felt welcomed and respected. This isn't about punishment or shame, she explained. It's about growth and recognition. Every time someone catches their own bias and chooses to act differently, that's a victory worth celebrating. The CEO stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the San Francisco Bay. After a moment, he turned back to the room. When I started in this industry 30 years ago, we thought good customer service meant treating everyone the same. Now I understand. It's not about treating everyone the same. It's about treating everyone with equal respect while recognizing their individual dignity. As the meeting drew to a close, plans were already being put into action. The training program would start the next day, with the crew from Ms. Chen's flight sharing their story. But more importantly, a fundamental shift had begun, from seeing bias as something to deny or hide to seeing it as something to acknowledge and address. Mr. Rodriguez walked Ms. Chen to her car afterward. "You know," he said, "when I got that call from you on the plane this morning, I was expecting a crisis. Instead, you turned it into an opportunity for transformation." Ms. Chen smiled as she opened her car door. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most challenging moments. The real test isn't whether we have biases, it's what we do once we recognize them. 6 months had passed since that memorable flight, and the airline's main training center was filled with activity. The room buzzed with conversation as flight crews from across the country gathered for their morning session. At the front of the room stood the same pilot and flight attendant who had confronted Ms. Chen that day, but they were different people now. "I remember thinking I was one of the good ones," the older flight attendant was saying to the group. 20 years of service, and I believed I treated everyone equally. It took one morning to show me how wrong I was. Her voice carried strength now, not shame. This was a story she had learned to tell with purpose. The pilot nodded, adding his perspective. "When they first asked us to lead these training sessions, I almost quit instead. Facing our mistakes publicly isn't easy. But then I realized our experience could help others recognize their own blind spots before they hurt someone." In the back of the room, Lai, now promoted to lead trainer, was setting up the interactive displays that showed real-time data from Clearview's bias detection system. The screens displayed impressive numbers. Customer satisfaction up 40%, discrimination complaints down 65%, employee satisfaction increased by 35%. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the stories shared during these sessions, the honest conversations that were happening across the airline industry. A young ground crew member raised his hand. "How do you handle it when you catch yourself making assumptions about passengers?" Before anyone could answer, the door opened and Ms. Chen walked in. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in warm applause. She waved it away with a smile, taking a seat at the back of the room. The older flight attendant smiled. "Actually, Ms. Chen's presence is perfect timing for this question. We've learned that the key isn't pretending we don't have biases, it's recognizing them quickly and correcting our behavior immediately." The pilot stepped forward. "Let me give you a recent example. Last week, I made an assumption about a passenger's ability to understand safety instructions based on their accent. I caught myself doing it, stopped, and changed my approach. Then I logged it in our system, not because I had to, but because sharing these moments helps others learn." On one of the screens, a video began playing. It showed various moments from the past 6 months. Crew members helping passengers with different needs, ground staff going out of their way to make everyone feel welcome, trainers working with new employees to build better awareness. Ms. Chen stood up and walked to the front of the room. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago, I never expected it would lead to this. But that's the thing about change. Sometimes it starts with one uncomfortable moment." She gestured to the data on the screens. "These numbers are impressive, but they're not what makes this program special. What makes it special is that we're creating a culture where people feel safe acknowledging their biases and working to overcome them." The young girl who had shared her notebook drawings on the flight had sent in an update video, which played on the main screen. She was showing off her school's new computer lab, where Clearview's adaptive learning software helped students of all abilities succeed together. "My teacher says computers are smart now because they learn from everyone," she explained in the video, holding up more of her drawings. just like we do." The room filled with gentle laughter, but her simple wisdom wasn't lost on anyone. Mr. Rodriguez, who had become a regular presence at these training sessions, stood up from his seat. "We've had other airlines asking to implement similar programs. The ripple effect has been remarkable." Indeed, the impact had spread far beyond one airline. Other companies had started reaching out, asking how they could create similar transformation in their own organizations. The training program had become a model for how to turn an incident of discrimination into lasting positive change. The older flight attendant shared how she now started each flight by checking her own assumptions. I asked myself, what judgments am I making without evidence? What stories am I telling myself about the passengers before I even speak to them? Lai stepped forward to demonstrate the latest version of the reporting system. It was simple enough for anyone to use, but sophisticated enough to identify patterns that might need attention. More importantly, it emphasized learning over punishment, growth over shame.